I picked JonBenet up. I carried her upstairs.
The police officer didn't complain about that?
No.
No, because usually...
It all happened so fast.
I found my daughter. I wasn't going to step back and say, oops, I'm not going to touch this. This is a crime scene.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. We're 10 minutes into John and Patsy's interview with Larry King to promote their book Death of Innocence in March 2000. We're about a quarter of the way through the 40-minute interview now. Once again, one can only do effective statement analysis if you know the facts of the case inside out, back to front and top to bottom. And so how well you know the case will reflect in how effectively, how deeply and thoroughly the analysis goes. Consider that measure. How well does this guy seem to know this case, the fabric, the schema, the details, as we drill down into the next 5 slips. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you are wowed, impressed, if you're finding information and revelations and insights here that you've never ever seen before anywhere else, 28 years later, then please express your appreciation in the comments. You can also hit the thanks button and let's get started. Number 1.
But he cried immediately, so he knew something seriously was wrong.
But hold on a second here. If Burke's voice was heard on the 911 call, and some said that Burke can be heard saying, "What did you find?" If that's the case, then Burke was likely told or knew what happened to his sister before the police even arrived. John also emphasizes here JonBenet's brother showing appropriate emotion. His sister had died and he immediately cried. But that's not the story we get from the Bonita papers. Listen to this. At about 7 a.m., John decided it was time to wake Burke. It had already been decided that Burke would be taken to the White's residence, where relatives were still staying for the holidays. John, accompanied by Fleet, went up to Burke's room. John woke his sleeping son. "Why don't you get up, buddy? You're going over to the White's house to see Fleet Jr." Burke's only reaction to the disturbance of his sleep was okay. Burke put his clothes on, grabbed his Nintendo and a couple of Christmas toys to take on his visit to his friend's house, and followed his father and Fleet downstairs. Fleet immediately took Burke outside to his vehicle and drove away. Never once did Burke ask why policemen were at his house. The only conversation that passed between the two during the ride was occasional mention of Burke's Nintendo he got for Christmas, which he had brought with him. So where is this thing about Burke crying immediately? Certainly not in that narrative. It's also not the impression we get of Burke at the memorial service. And there is video footage of a smiling Burke running around outside the church in Boulder, or indeed the Burke we see on Dr. Phil. Number 2.
First officer, French, who was there, he said, "Mrs. Ramsey, if my child were missing, I would want Detective Arndt looking for her."
Now, it's interesting to me how Patsy repeats a statement from a third party, the first responding officer, in this case, Officer French, with words that come perilously close to those kicking off the ransom note.
He said, "Mrs. Ramsey, if my..."
Okay, Patsy, but what aren't you telling us about Linda Arndt? Well, let's go to the New York Times. Local newspapers have criticized Detective Arndt, a crimes investigator and victims advocacy specialist, for bonding with Mrs. Ramsey during the early hours of the investigation, and that bonding would go on over time. Is it true that Linda Arndt was the best officer to have on the job? It's funny, you also had someone else bonding with them, Detective Lou Smith. Anyway, it's thanks to Linda Arndt suggesting that John go off and look through the house that a massive boo-boo occurred. John, quote-unquote, finding JonBenet, altering the scene and carrying her upstairs. Number 3.
Did the FBI get called in?
We were told the FBI was called. We kept asking, where are they? Why aren't they here? They were told, well, they're on their way.
Well, John is right. The FBI were called, but it seems they were monitoring the situation at Boulder Police Station, that they were on standby. Now, according to an article published in early July 1997 in the New York Times, case of JonBenet Ramsey stalls on error and rivalry. Listen to this. Detective John Eller, who is in charge of the JonBenet investigation, is openly looking for another job. The 50-year-old police commander has kept the role of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, at a minimum in the JonBenet case, the first homicide investigation of his career. So you kind of get the idea that the FBI wanted to be involved, but he was kind of kept away because of the detective in charge of the investigation, Eller. It was Commander Eller who didn't want the FBI in the Ramsey home. For that matter, sniffer dogs were also suggested, and that suggestion was also overruled. The article goes on to note, Denver newspapers have suggested that Eller has been reacting in pique because the Bureau once rejected him for a management class. Seems a little juvenile, doesn't it? So it's not that they weren't called or weren't involved, they simply weren't with the Ramseys, possibly because the ransom note said not to call the police, and then also because of Eller's feeling on the matter. Hence, you had only a single officer in the home for much of that morning. But take note of how John frames it.
Hours, and of course they never came.
What had looked like a kidnapping for ransom had turned into a murder. It was now a case for the local police, not the FBI.
That's another thing John Ramsey neglects to mention, is that the JonBenet Ramsey case wasn't a kidnapping, it was a murder. And so the FBI wouldn't be involved in a case like that anyway. And yet they were involved to begin with.
Not the FBI.
And I told them it's no longer our jurisdiction. But I said, you've got a contaminated crime scene. You've got to get these people out of the house.
It was absolute chaos.
I thought John said, of course they never came. That sounds like they were there in order to say, you've got a contaminated crime scene, you need to get the people out the house.
Hours, and of course they never came.
Again, I find that a little disingenuous because the ambit of the ransom note, the whole thing was, if you call law enforcement, she dies. And so certainly law enforcement must have been aware of that, which is why only Linda Arndt was at the house. Meanwhile, you've got the Ramseys after the fact saying, I don't know why the FBI weren't there. I don't know why there wasn't much of a reaction from law enforcement. Well, look at what the ransom note demanded, right? And so the other question is, as I say, didn't the FBI arrive? Because if I understand correctly, it was an FBI officer, Ron Walker, who actually saw Patsy looking at him through splayed fingers. How could he do that? How could he observe that if he wasn't at the scene?
FBI agent Ron Walker.
The sergeant and I saddled up. He said, I'm going to the house. Let's go.
By now, John Ramsey had picked up JonBenet's body.
Also, in Detective Steve Thomas's resignation letter, he also refers to the District Attorney Alex Hunter ignoring the opinions of experts from the FBI. Quote, during the investigation, detectives would discover, collect, and bring evidence to the District Attorney's office only to have it summarily dismissed or rationalized as insignificant. The significant opinions of national experts were casually dismissed or ignored by the District Attorney's office. Even the experienced FBI were waved aside. And there's also this. An FBI agent whom I didn't even know quietly tipped me off about what the DA's office was doing behind our backs, conducting an investigation the police department was wholly unaware of. The Ramseys seemed to want the FBI involved conditionally, good enough for certain aspects, but not good enough to conduct polygraphs on them. Number 4.
The toughest part of all, John, how do you find your daughter?
I found her after Linda Arndt asked us to go through the house, look for anything out of ordinary.
Now, if you backtrack to the statement John has just made about the FBI, where John speaks fluidly, even quickly, he suddenly slows down here, where Larry asks, how do you find your daughter? Notice how when he talks about finding JonBenet, he doesn't really describe JonBenet. He describes everything else, the room that he finds her in and what the room is used for. Wouldn't your priority be in noticing JonBenet and noticing the state she's in, not describing the situation around her?
and I found her in the basement.
Where?
She was in a room that probably originally was a coal cellar. It was a 4 concrete walled room.
Wow, a room with 4 walls. Anyway, he describes everything else, the room that he finds her in and what the room is used for. Now, have a look at John's face when Larry asks, "Did you know instantly she was dead?" And then he closes his eyes and drops his head and says no. And that is number 5.
You know she was dead?
No.
Let's watch that again in slow motion.
You know she was dead?
No. I didn't.
It's strange that John says he didn't know that JonBenet had died because Linda Arndt seemed to know instantly, and she said it was obvious JonBenet had been dead for a while.
And JonBenet was clearly dead. Then she's been dead for a while.
Besides all this, and apologies for the graphic description, when John carried her, rigor had set in, which meant JonBenet's frame was stiff and her arms remained outstretched over her head as John carried her. I also find it weird John saying he had this rush, saying, "Thank God we found her."
And I had this rush of just, thank God I found her.
Also worth noting, John makes no attempt in his own narrative to check for signs of life, a pulse, JonBenet breathing. He makes no effort to talk to JonBenet either, doesn't say her name, doesn't call out to her. But the biggest whopper in this segment, and perhaps in the whole interview, is when Larry asks John why, when he found JonBenet, he didn't simply summon the officer who was already in the house. And then it happens.
Are you sure you want to hear this?
Are you sure you want to see this? As John tries to make the case of a father's love for his daughter at the time of finding her deceased, look at what happens.
Child, I loved her.
Instinctive reaction.
Where were you, Patsy?
I was upstairs.
A massive smile breaks through, perhaps the biggest smile in the whole interview. Let's watch that again in slow motion.
Child, I loved her.
Instinctive reaction.
Where were you, Patsy?
I was up.
Why didn't you call a police officer to come right over and take care of her? I mean,
This
that's
is
what
my
every...
child. I loved her.
Instinctive reaction.
Where were you, Patsy?
I was upstairs with.
Now let's watch even slower without the sound. This is arguably the biggest smile John gives during the entire interview, but the pertinent point is when it happens, and I guess why. I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.